This is a Geek Leader podcast, and I'm your host, John Rauda. This show is all about helping us grow as leaders, become better technologists, and improve our lives both at work and at home. I hope you enjoy the show and learn a lot. Hello, world, and welcome to episode 213 of Geek Leader Podcast. I'm your host, John Rauda. APIs are the backbone of modern interconnected software systems. Join us at the API Live at Manning conference to ensure your APIs are flexible, functional, and user-friendly. Listen to expert speakers discuss API design patterns, effective development methodologies, and the latest tools for designing amazing APIs at the Live at Manning API conference. Go to geekleader.com/API for more information. Again, this conference is August 3rd, and it's free. Again, geekleader.com/API. All right, Geek Leaders. Today on the show, we've got a return guest from Dr. Gleb Tspiursky, and we're going to be talking about returning back to the office. You may remember when Gleb was on before, where we talked about about going with your gut and how you should react when you're doing that, when you should never go with your gut and things like that. But he is a disaster avoidance expert, which is one of the really important skills right now as we're coming out of a pandemic. So with all that being said, Gleb, welcome back to the show.
Thank you very much, Sean. I'm glad to be back.
So tell the audience, if anybody, we've picked up, a good bit of new listeners since the last time. If you don't mind, just tell the audience a little bit about kind of how you got to where you are in your career and what you do exactly right now.
Sure. I've always been fascinated by how we make decisions, and especially how we make decisions badly. I've seen business leaders making really bad decisions over time. So I was coming of age. I was 18 in 1999 when all the business leaders were praised who were in the tech companies, the Boo, Pets.com, Webvan, and so on, all of those companies. And then just a couple of years later, when all those companies went bust, they were all criticized in the Wall Street Journal and so on. And the decision-making of these leaders wasn't different. It was the same leaders. They were making the same style of decisions. They had the same approach. It was just that the outcomes were different. So clearly, the decision makers there were not making the best decisions. And the people who were telling us about how business leaders should make decisions didn't know what they were talking about. Praising leaders at one moment and then criticizing them a couple of years later just because of the different outcomes. So that was a real concern for me. How do we make good decisions? How do leaders make good decisions? And so I decided to study this. That's what I geeked out on. So I studied this for about 20 years. I did consulting, coaching, training, at the same time as I spent time in academia researching these topics as a behavioral scientist. So now I've spent 15 years in academia at the UNC Chapel Hill, where I was a fellow, and then I was a professor at the Ohio State University, so go Bucks, in the Decision Sciences Collaborative. And now I'm focusing my time on helping companies figure out what the future is all about. So I run a future-proofing consultancy called Disaster Avoidance Experts, which helps leaders who are concerned about the future figure out what is the best way of moving forward, decide on the best ways of moving forward. Because, there are plenty of folks who are concerned about the future, but they don't know exactly what to do about their concerns, how to make the best decisions around their concerns. And so they're not sure about that. So help them see around the corner and understand what are the threats and opportunities facing them. And then there are people who are more clear and, okay, this is kind of where I want to go, but I'm not sure about the path to get there. And for those folks, we help them figure out what is the best path to get there. And so that's what led me to writing my book that you interviewed me about last time, Never Go With Your Gut, How Pioneering Leaders Make the Best Decisions and Avoid Business Disasters. Because that's what research shows is going with your gut, as so many people advise us, is a bad idea. And now I've been helping folks throughout the pandemic make good decisions around COVID risks, managing them, how to figure all of that out. And now my focus is on how to return to the office effectively and how to lead hybrid and remote teams. So that's actually the topic of my newest book, Returning to the Office and Leading Hybrid and Remote Teams, a manual on benchmarking to best practices for competitive advantage, available on Amazon and elsewhere. And so that's what we're here to talk about.
Yeah. So one of the things that I've always liked about your writing is that you include a lot of research. and a lot of data from surveys and from interviews and it's information that you pull together. What is the research saying right now about return to work and how employees feel about that and how employers are feeling about that?
Yeah, so the book that we're talking about here is based on a number of research studies. Just so folks who are, the listeners of a Geek Leader like the geek out on the research, so I'll just briefly mention the research. One is my own research. So that's research where I did 61 interviews with leaders, 47 mid-level leaders and 14 senior leaders in 12 companies that I advised on developing and implementing a strategic approach for returning to the office. So that's one component of the research. That's my own research. Then there's a lot of research that has been done, peer-reviewed research in how to lead remote teams, hybrid teams effectively, how to return to the office after major disasters. So lots of peer-reviewed research there. And then survey research on how people are feeling about returning to the office right now. I think that's kind of what you were focusing on in the survey research question. Mm-hmm. So let's talk about the survey research question. So the book cites 8 major surveys that came out in the spring of 2021. So really recent surveys figuring out what do people want about returning to the office. And the research clearly shows that employees who can work remotely, which is the majority of the US workforce, so over half of the US workforce can work remotely. The employees who can do a significant part of their work remotely would very much like, on the whole, to do a significant part of their work remotely. Only something like 1/5 or less want to return to the office full time. And that's from a variety of 8 surveys. By the way, these surveys are done by venues like the Harvard Business School, venues like Harris Poll, so independent polling organizations, the SHRM, the Society for Human Resource Management, so a broad society for concerned about human resources, objective venues, companies like Slack, companies like Microsoft Teams. And the nice thing about Slack and Microsoft Teams is that they don't only do surveys of asking people, they also use their internal data from Slack, from Microsoft Teams, from LinkedIn, which is also owned by Microsoft, to give them additional data on what people want and how they behave. Mm-hmm. So that's where the data is coming from. So we see that overwhelmingly, go ahead. You had a question?
No, go ahead. Just keep going.
Cool. So overwhelmingly, we see that people don't want to return to the office full time. Now, what do they actually want? We see that anywhere from something like a quarter to a third, sometimes more, depending on the survey of people, want to remain fully remote. So anywhere between a quarter to a third of all employees want to remain fully remote, and especially those who moved during the pandemic away from their offices, which plenty of people did. So that's going to be especially difficult if they're trying to be forced back into the office. So that's kind of a component. Now, the majority, something like 60 to 70%, depending on the surveys, want some kind of hybrid schedule. And that might mean coming into the office 1 or 2 days a week, definitely no more than half the time per week of half their work week, to meet with their colleagues, do some collaborative work in the office, and do their individual tasks at home. So something like 1 or 2 days a week is the best fit for the most people, for the plurality of the people. Now, so that's kind of what they want. Now, there are a number of other dynamics in the surveys that's really important to keep in mind. Over 2/5, and anywhere ranging from 42% to 58% in the surveys, said they would leave their current job if they didn't have the option to work remotely at least half the time. So right now, people might have heard about the term of the Great Resignation, where lots of people are leaving their companies because they've had pent-up desires to leave during the pandemic, and because some bosses didn't handle the pandemic very well, and also are kind of being jerky about forcing people to come back to the office. And we can talk about that. So that a number of people are leaving, and this is aided by the fact that so many companies are hiring, recruiting so many people, part of the post-pandemic recovery. So they have many opportunities. So lots of people are looking to leave if they're being forced to go back to the office. That's very clear. Now, about some employees do feel some concern if they are working from home while other employees like them are not. So that's kind of a concern that needs to be addressed for companies that are managing the return to the workplace, what does that look like? When you ask employees what they see as the benefits of working from home, they see flexibility from telework as a key benefit. They're willing to sacrifice a lot of earnings for it. On average, 8% of their earnings, they're willing to sacrifice. So that's a huge, huge amount of money that people are willing to sacrifice for the flexibility of telework. Interestingly, employees are much more productive on average, of course, when working from home. They work something like 20 more hours, from an average of 10 to 14% more productive, working 20 more hours on average from home per month, of course. So per month, which is understandable because employees don't have a commute, they don't have a lot of hassles and distractions that they do in the office. So employees are much better, especially their individual tasks, doing at home, doing away from the office. The collaborative tasks, that depends on the task. Some tasks are better done in person, some tasks you can do fine online. Now, for mental health and well-being, over 3/4 of all employees, so depending on the surveys, 75 to 80% will feel happier and more engaged if they are able to work from home a substantial amount of time. They're willing to go the extra mile, they feel less stressed, and they have more work-life balance. So that's really important to understand. Employees also report that they needed quite a bit more funding for home offices and equipment. Only 25% of companies provide such training. So that's such funding. That's really a problem. So that's something that needs to be addressed. Another thing that is a challenge of telework, working from home, that companies are overwhelmingly not addressing is something that 60+% of employees report that there is problematic virtual communication collaboration. That's the biggest challenges with remote work, and they want a lot of training in these areas, and that's something that's not being done. So that's kind of the conclusions, the overall conclusions, sort of a meta-analysis of all of these surveys.
So let's dig into this a little bit, because it seems like there's a lot of problems that we could solve just by talking it out right now. Like, for example, if people would take an 8% reduction, you could use that 8% to fund at home equipment, desk, chairs, pay for internet for higher bandwidth and things like that to improve some of those at home working environments and situations.
So that's one issue that's definitely a tricky one, because employees are not willing to have their current salaries cut. That would suck. Imagine having your current salary cut. How that would work is that they're willing to take lower promotions, low raises, in exchange for people who are coming to the office would get higher raises or something like that, and that they would also get funding for working from home. Now, where that money would come from, that money would really not come from their salaries. That's not the main place where it would come from. It would come from employees cutting down on their real estate, their office space. So imagine if you have employees coming back to the office maybe 1 day a week, 2 days a week. So what's happening right now to your real estate? Your previous, let's set your pre-pandemic occupancy at 100%, right? Now, about 10 to 30%, so an average of 20%, depending on the kind of company. We're not talking about manufacturing companies, we're talking about the office part of a company. So about 10 to 30% is necessary as kind of basic venues, like your finances, your checks, all of that sort of stuff. You need to keep those. The rest is really based on occupancy. 80% of your real estate is based on occupancy. So if you have people coming in, an average of a day and a half per week, let's say that. So you have much less occupancy than you did when you had them coming in for 5 days a week, right? So that's a 70% reduction in occupancy. So 70% reduction of the 80%. So you'll have something like you have a 55% less need for office space than you did before. That's a huge savings. Now, that real estate that you can cut, the 55% of your real estate, and then office-based expenses like security, janitorial expenses, products like commercial printers and so on, that's where the money will come from to fund working from home activities.
That makes sense. That makes perfect sense. But what about, some of the other issues that maybe, playing devil's advocate here, when the surveys were done, people were relatively new at working from home for most people. Most people were still in this honeymoon phase of working from home. But then something that I know you've talked about before, I've actually read a blog that you sent out a while back about Zoom fatigue. And what about when those set in? What can we as companies and leaders do to help our employees that may be going through that and may have
Sure.
changed their mind when they said, "Oh yeah, I want to work from home," but now I'm just like, "Gosh, I can't do another Zoom meeting. I need to see somebody face to
No,
face."
yeah, sure. Fair question. So just to be very clear, the surveys were done in the spring of 2021. So
Okay.
completely these are the surveys from spring 2021. So a year of working from home. So
Mm-hmm.
it's not a honeymoon period. I must have miscommunicated. These are very much very relevant surveys. So spring people have been working from home for a year. Now, for Zoom fatigue, that's definitely a real condition, a real phenomenon. And that's something I talk about in the book. So the challenge with Zoom fatigue is having meetings that are not necessary, absolutely not necessary. Zoom fatigue is a problem where we get tired and drained during video conferences. Most people feel more tired and drained from a video conference meeting than they would feel from a similar length and intensity in-person meeting, because we don't get that in-person energy boosting interaction and
Mm-hmm.
seeing each other. So that's one of the things that the book talks about employees feeling more Zoom fatigue. And that's one reason why what I recommend for the best course of action for companies is to have employees coming in to the office 1 to 2 days a week. So you can reserve all of your meetings, all of your in-person meetings, of the large majority of them, for the in-person activities in the office. So that's going to be the best venue for them. That your office will be your space for collaborative activities, and working at home will be your space for individual tasks. That's going to be the division in the workspace of the future. Something that's really important for that to remember is that employees will need to be trained on this. This will not be an easy thing for them to do just naturally, because they've never done this they've never done this division. Previously, they either did all their work in the office or all of their work at home during the pandemic. So now they need to be trained on how to handle hybrid work effectively. So that's going to be the majority of employees. That's what my strong recommendation is for the majority of employees. Something like 60 to 80% of your company workforce, to have that. Then to have some flexibility for those employees who really want to do fully remote. So that's maybe 10 to 30% of your workforce. And that's, if people moved away from the office and if they really want to work remotely, and very importantly, if they can succeed in working remotely, and if it works for their team, whatever their team is doing, then they can definitely work remotely. And you don't want to have too many Zoom meetings. That's one of the things that the book talks about. You want to reduce the number of Zoom meetings, and that's going to be very important to having people be less trained. So that's, I think, the key point that I wanted to want to share there.
Yeah. So you kind of hit on this a little bit, but I want to get into it a little bit more about, I'll throw my HR hat on and talk about being fair. Because, one of the things we always want to do is what's fair for everybody. And like you mentioned, some employees have moved away and now they're 100% remote, whereas other employees have to be at the office. And there's some positions, let's say, for instance, help desk. You're a support person, a help desk person. And if you have people coming into the office a certain number of days a week or partially, then those people need to be there to support the conference room equipment, the PCs, the laptops, and desktops. And those are activities that you can't really do remote. You have to be
Yep.
on site to do that. So how would you justify that, the fairness of some people having to come in and other people not?
I think it's not a question of fairness. I think it's a question of which jobs people choose. Some people choose a job that requires them to be there on site. Some people choose a job that doesn't. If you are a veterinary technician or a veterinarian, right? You can't do your job if you're not on site.
Right.
If you're an accountant or if you're a computer programmer, you can do your job if you're on site. So it really depends on the job you choose. And that's something that's just about you, about your choices and what you chose to invest your skills and time into. And you can certainly choose to upskill yourself if you want a job that allows you remote work. And that's something that definitely many people have done during the pandemic. They've chosen to upskill themselves and find a job that they can do fully remotely. So if that's something you want to do, that's great. That's something that you should do, and go ahead, do that. So that's kind of one part of the answer. The second part of the answer has to do with raises. So I mentioned that people who are working remotely are willing to take pay cuts for the benefits of working remotely. Not pay cuts, but reductions in raises. So in the future, I would recommend stronger, bigger raises for people who are working in the office, kind of those essential personnel, and smaller raises for people who are working remotely. And then some of the money will go back to the people who are working remotely as expense budgets for for ergonomic furniture, nice technology, and so on, but less than they would have gotten in the raise, I would presume.
Okay, gotcha. So tell me about this great resignation. And I imagine people upskilling that we've been talking about will be part of that. And then the other people that, like you said, have moved and their leaders may be saying that, hey, you got to be back in the office. They're like, hey, I live in Puerto Rico now, so I'm not going back to the office, and things like that. And also people that maybe they weren't happy with their company's response to the pandemic or to other things that have happened during 2020. Like in your book, you talk about diversity, inclusion, and things like that. Maybe companies didn't have a good response to some of the events that we've encountered here in the United States during that time. So they decide that, hey, I'm jumping ship. I'm going somewhere else. What is this great resignation and how is it going to impact everybody else?
Sure. So let's talk about this great resignation. And what I want to highlight is that leaders are making some pretty bad decisions right now. And we can talk about why. This has to do with the gut decision making that leaders are leaning into, which is pretty bad. Like I said in my previous book, Never Go With Your Gut. This is a problem. Now, let me give you an example of how this is a problem. So Google, around February, announced that they will have a policy where all of their employees will have to come to the office, except for something like 2 weeks out of a year. That was their announcement in February, that Google said, okay, this is what we're going to do. You'll have to come to the office 3 days a week at least, some people 4 to 5 days, and you can only work 2 weeks out of the year remotely. So that's what happened in February. Now, about 5 weeks ago, so that was sometime in the end of April, they changed their minds, and let me tell you why. So from some of my internal sources at Google, there was a lot of conflict and a lot of tensions because a lot of the jobs that software programmers can do, pretty much the whole job of software programmers can be done remotely, right? Let's be honest. You don't need to be in the office to do that. And a lot of the best software programmers wanted to do all of their jobs remotely. They didn't feel like going to the office, interacting with people, and they moved and so on. And so a number of people started leaving. And that was definitely a concern for Google, who were very much hunting for top talent and competing with companies like Amazon and Facebook, which Facebook said all of our remote workers can work remotely permanently for however long you want. All the rest of your career at Facebook is totally fine. And so Facebook, of course, was getting these people, and other companies were getting these people. And so Google changed their minds. They said, we screwed up. Now we will allow people to work at, about 20% of our workforce to work remotely, and another 20% can work in an office near them instead of their original office. But 60% of our workforce will come to the office in a hybrid schedule, which is much more reasonable from a perspective of what's going on here. Mm-hmm. And so that is an example of where leaders made bad decisions that led to resignation of a bunch of people. And we see the same things happening at other companies that are making these decisions. JP Morgan is forcing employees to come back to the office. Jamie Dimon says, well, some people don't like their commute. So what? Well, you know what? That's a really arrogant jerk thing to say. Yeah. And a lot of people at JP Morgan don't like that. And they will be looking for another place. Plenty of places that are allowing finance, banking venues that are allowing people to work remotely full time. So that's going to be happening. And so there are a number of stories like this I can share. So that's basically what the Great Resignation is about, where people right now in the middle of a recruiting boom are looking to leave, and leaders are making some bad decisions because of what I talk about in the book are called cognitive biases, these dangerous judgment errors that cause us to be tied to faulty mental patterns. And leaders want to go back to a time before the pandemic where they were comfortable and they have very strong gut intuitions that, hey, the right way to work is face to face in the office. That's where they were successful. Leaders are those who have been in their jobs for 20, 30, sometimes 40 years. And they've been successful for face to face in office interactions. That's where their success comes from. Whereas their employees, many of them, especially younger ones, they're leaders that they have a sense of technology as something that's an add-on to the previous work activities that they were doing. They really began their careers before technology became such a major thing. Whereas employees, younger employees especially, are native digital. They are very comfortable with technology and they have grown used to working remotely. And so right now, the experience of going to the office has been built on top of their native digital experience. And now working remotely, they have perceived this, okay, this is a much nicer way of working for us for a substantial amount of time at least. So I want to work much more remotely than leaders want. So this, I can talk about the cognitive biases that cause us to make bad decisions, but that is kind of the cause of the Great Resignation, these cognitive biases and this bad decision making that leaders make around going back to the office.
So has this Great Resignation started, or when will it begin, and what do we need to do about that?
Oh yeah, it's definitely started. I gave you the example of Google and other companies. Yeah, you're already seeing a number of employees leaving because they're being forced to go back to the office, and number of employees are actively searching. So Microsoft was in their survey found that the number of job interest in finding a new position in their not surveys, but for LinkedIn, where people are saying open to work, all of that stuff, remote work, that it's doubled recently. And so there's a lot of people who are looking for new jobs. No question about it. Yep.
So how is that going to affect industry and business in general? And mostly what we're talking about are people that have jobs that can work remotely, not like plumbers or electricians or truck drivers that have to be, on site. We're not talking about those employees right now, are we? Or are we?
We're only talking about people who can work remotely, which is a little over half of the U.S. workforce.
Correct. Okay. And what is that impact going to be for everybody else, like the people that maybe choose to stay where they're at?
So I think this is going to be talent wars 2.0 essentially. This means that there's a huge war for talent going on right now. Leaders often say that people are our most precious resource. People are our competitive advantage. Our people are a competitive advantage. But when you're forcing people to go back to the office, when you're really fundamentally disrupting their daily routines. I mean, think about this. People have gotten used to, the pandemic has changed their habits, their norms, their values, their preferences. And when you're trying to disrupt their basic routines, how they're used to working and what they're comfortable with, that is a huge problem for people. And so right now, this means that we're in the middle of an escalating war for talent, where so many companies are recruiting employees. Where these, I mean, you've probably seen of a lot of headlines about shortage of employees, many positions unfilled. Well, guess what? These positions are going to be filled by employees who are going to go from other companies where they don't want to be working, where the companies aren't giving them the conditions that they want, which again, overwhelmingly, they want hybrid a plurality want hybrid, and a substantial majority want remote only. Only a small minority want full-time in the workplace activities. And a number of companies are making some bad decisions about that. So you're seeing the impact of that will be that the most talented people are the ones who tend to want more flexibility, who want more autonomy, who want more flexibility over their schedules. And they will be the people who will be most able to shift positions, shift companies. So companies that want to succeed in the future, that want to really retain a competitive advantage, they will need to cater to these folks. They will need to cater to the talent that is right now very ready and willing to leave. And think about this, the talent previously, the kind of talent wars that were going on were limited by the fact that, if you wanted to work in Amazon, you had to move to Seattle. If you wanted to, work in Facebook, you had to move to Palo Alto, right? Right now, if you want to work in those places, you don't. You can just live where you are, and it's much more comfortable. People don't have to disrupt their lives. They don't have to pick up and move. They can just change their jobs. They can change their positions, and they can keep their previous social circles. They can keep their membership in various churches and value-based groups and clubs. They can keep their environment, whatever they want. So it's much easier to switch positions right now when there's remote availability. And that means especially an escalation of these talent wars. And again, leaders are making some pretty bad decisions when they're trying to force employees to go back to the office, which is really at odds with what they need to be doing if they want to succeed in the future. And that's kind of what I talk about in the book. What are the steps that you need to do to adapt? It's not simply saying, hybrid workforce with remote only options for some, and that just works magic and everybody's ready. The second part of the book is about what do you actually need to do to make a hybrid based company work with remote only options. What does that mean? How do you need to change things? How do you need to shift your office environment? How do you need to adapt your culture? How do you need to adapt your performance evaluation? What about changing your training? What about diversity inclusion concerns? How do you address all of those sorts of things to make sure that you're successful in this new normal?
But what are some of those things that we need to do to be successful in this new normal?
Well, one of the most important things is that you want to first decide on what will be your future or arrangement. And what I strongly recommend is that you let teams, you give teams a broad guidelines. So for example, you tell team leaders, and I'm talking team leaders, I'm talking about the leads, the lower level supervisors who are the leaders of the rank and file teams. What you tell them is, hey, from the top, we're talking from the leadership perspective, aim to have your people coming in 1 to 2 days a week, a maximum 3 days a week. And if some want remote only, and if they can succeed at remote only, then give them that flexibility. And the team leaders should decide how their teams will collaborate. 1 day a week is kind of a baseline for the companies. 12 companies that I work with, most teams decided to come in 1 day a week. So then you choose which 1 day a week you come in. You kind of have a system where they're not coming in on the same days so that you can maximize effective use of office space. And the teams all come in, all team members come in on that same day, and they do a lot of collaborative activities, brainstorming and whatnot. That's their main office space use. That means that office space, that's the second part, has to be changed very much. So to accommodate collaborative activities. So you're going to get rid of a lot of your office space based on how many people are coming in. So again, if you have an average of 1.5 days a week, all of your people coming in, that means that you can get rid of 55% of your office space, and the rest of it needs to be shifted to be much more collaborative. That means doing away with individual workspaces, making them much more hot desk oriented, and making the large majority of your spaces for your collaborative. Right now, the typical distribution is that 20% of office space is collaborative and something like 80% is private. That's pre-pandemic. Now it should be something like maybe 1/3 is aimed at hot desking and 2/3 is for collaboration. Well, that means everything from video conference rooms to nice, comfortable lounges for informal collaboration. And of course, you want to keep some offices for leaders who need to have private conversations and other folks who need to have private conversations. But otherwise, you want to just do hot desking. So that's the second part. You want to change your office space, figure out how to do that, reshaping it. Now, the next part is revising your performance evaluation. There are still way too many leaders. One of the reasons that they want to come in is because there's a gut reaction, gut feeling that, hey, if my employees aren't here and if I can't see them, then they're not working. Still too many leaders have that mentality, and that's a very bad mentality. It evaluates their performance by how long they are in the office and how much they are observed by the leader to be working. So that's not great. You want to focus, change your performance evaluation very much to be away from time spent on task to accomplishment of task, to deliverable delivered. And that means that you want to change your performance evaluation from that, quarterly performance evaluation or the annual big performance evaluation, which is the worst. You want to shift instead toward small, frequent performance evaluations, weekly performance evaluations, small ones, where the employee provides a brief report on, hey, what are my top three accomplishments for this week? Then what were my challenges for this week? How have I solved these challenges? What do I plan to work on next week? And how would I evaluate my performance on a scale of, say, like 1 to 5? That's a typical for the companies that I help. So then you have that report sent to a supervisor, the team leader, and then the team leader meets with the employee for 15 to 30-minute meeting where they discuss the plans, the accomplishments, what they did. The leader gives them some coaching on how to address challenges. They agree on what the team member will do for the next week, and then they agree or revise the self-evaluation. And that evaluation gets fed into the promotion and evaluation system. And then once a year, you have a bigger evaluation, or quarterly, whatever the system is. You have a bigger evaluation, which determines pay raises and performance evaluations. That's a much, much better, and promotions. That's a much better system than time spent. So that's the third thing you need to do. Change that. Then you need to adapt your culture. So your culture will be really different from one that's all in the office, Monday through Friday, 9 to 5, to having people come to the office 1 day a week and then having some people work remotely full time. So you need to change your culture to adapt to this new situation. And my book talks about a number of things that I can go in depth into, but the crucial thing that you want to be thinking about is you don't want to transpose your existing office culture on virtual/hybrid teams. That does not work well. The Zoom happy hours that so many people had during the pandemic, those did not work well. That's not what a good function of Zoom happy hours, that's socializing. You need to figure out a way of connecting your people to your company culture, especially while they're in the office. And there can be a number of initiatives done for that. Socializing things, educational things, connecting things that make people feel connected to the culture, and also things that done while they're working virtually, remotely. So for example, one of the things I talk about is doing digital co-working, where every day that you're working at home, you just do a video conference meeting with your team members for an hour or more, whatever feels right, where you do digital co-working. You sign in, you turn your microphone off, you leave your speakers on, and then you can have your video on or off, whatever you prefer. And then you just co-work with your coworkers. You share at the beginning what you plan to work on, and then you just do that. And if you have questions along the way, you turn your microphone on and you ask your coworkers. It's a great experience. And then you report out at the end what you worked on, what you accomplished, and then you sign off. It's been a really great bonding experience for folks. They find that it's really helpful for them. It's motivating for them to do their work, and it's good for them to get questions answered. And that's just one example out of what you want to do for adapting your culture. Another activity that you want to be thinking about is addressing DEI concerns, so diversity, equity, and inclusion in the new normal.
Yep.
So an interesting point is that a study by Slack found that when you look at knowledge workers, so tech workers and so on, 79% of white knowledge workers wanted to either a hybrid or fully remote workers, a hybrid or fully remote model. That means that 21% wanted to go back to the workforce, to the office full time. But Black knowledge workers, only 3% of them want to go back to the office full time. Only 3%. And why is that? Well, in the office, they experience discrimination, microaggressions, and all of that. And there's some of that they experience online as well, cyberbullying, harassment, but to a much lesser extent. And so you definitely want to address the cyberbullying and harassment, but you also want to address their underlying concerns that cause them to not want to go back to the office. Finally, another thing that you want to be thinking about is upskilling employees for the hybrid first model. You want to train employees in how to do hybrid work effectively, how to separate their work from their individual work to do at home mainly, to their collaborative work to do in the office. And their collaborative work to do in the office is going to be much more important than it was before, when you can meet anytime, they need to prepare much better for their collaborative work in the office because they have less time available for it 1 day a week. So that's one example. Lots of other things. They need to be trained in virtual communication and collaboration. I've been surprised by how few companies invested in this during the pandemic. There's a lot of things about virtual communication and collaboration that people can be trained in to be much more effective at it, especially when you have hybrid meetings where some people in the team will be in the office and some people will be virtual. Those are especially challenging. So there's a lot of virtual communication and collaboration that people need to be trained in. So those are the areas that I talk about that workers need to be, that we need to address in order to really succeed in this new post-pandemic normal for the people who actually want a competitive advantage by making sure that they get the best talent and retain the best talent.
Awesome. I think that's great. Now, what if you're one of those employees that one of the minority of the employees that doesn't want to work remote, that wants to be in the office, that needs to be, doesn't have the discipline, let's say, to to work when people aren't around, and you don't live in a place that has a good opportunity to work. I know we've had people in our office that live in areas where they do not have high-speed internet. There's no possibility of getting high-speed internet where they live, and they have to be either in an office or go to a coffee shop in order to work remotely. What is your take on those?
So a couple of takes. One is that if those people want to not work in the actual company office, those people can go work in a coffee shop, and they'll still remote work. It's not work at home simply, it's remote work away from the office. And they can also go to a co-working space. So I talk about funding for home offices, funding for working at home. That means things like getting good internet, if it's available, of course, video cameras, technology, laptops, microphones, making sure to have ergonomic furniture, making sure to have quiet spaces, room separators, all of that. That's one component of it. Another component of it can be paying for an employee to have access to a co-working space. So the companies that I worked with generally paid something like $2,000 to $3,000 per employee per year. So they made that budget for them working from home, their expenses, because of course now that's part of the sort of company office where that's where employees are working from home. And if employees want to spend part of that on remote, working in a co-working space, that's great. That's up to them. So that's one part of the answer. The second part of the answer is they can come to the office and occupy part of the desk that's part of the space that's devoted to hot desking. So they can certainly easily come to the office. Just because your team comes to the office 1 day a week doesn't mean that you can't come all the rest of the 4 days and work wherever you want as part of the hot desking. It just means that your team members won't be around. You'll be working around with other employees who are part of the company. So that's
Gotcha.
so those are the two components of the answer that I would give.
Gotcha. Okay, cool. And now, what should leaders do if they implemented this hybrid approach or this remote work approach, and they have certain employees that seem to be taking advantage of the situation and aren't being productive? They're just you send them a Slack message and it takes them 2 to 3 hours to respond back. And you find that their actual productivity is really falling off the rails here. What should you do to encourage or to help that person, or should you just end the employment?
I think that's definitely part of the performance evaluation. And that's why it's very important to not have only quarterly reviews, and especially not only annual reviews, but to have weekly reviews, weekly reviews that are task-based. What is this employee delivering? If part of their deliverable is to respond to Slack messages promptly, then that should be part of the conversation. And if that's not part of the deliverable, well, maybe it's not a big deal, right? So it really depends on whether, if you are sending the Slack message after hours, then definitely I don't think that there should be an obligation for an employee to respond promptly. Unfortunately, too many leaders do have that expectation that employees will respond promptly after hours. That's a problem. That's cutting into work-life balance, and that's something that should be addressed. And I talk about that in the book, how to address that, making sure that employees have good work-life balance. But the underlying point that you're asking is about productivity fall-off. And the productivity fall-off has to be addressed through those weekly performance evaluations that are based on deliverables, that are based on accomplishments, that are based on tasks done. If employees are not meeting the tasks, then that will be shown very clearly in the evaluation, in the weekly evaluation, in the performance evaluation. And part of the performance evaluation is for the leader to coach the employee into working better. That's part of the responsibility of any leader. How do you coach your employees? How do you coach your team members into working better? And that means, that can mean anything from giving tips and tricks for time management and organization up to creating a remedial plan for dealing with serious issues with certain timelines and guide and steps for improvement that if the employee doesn't meet, it's on him or her, and it's up to them whether they want to meet that plan or not. And if they don't want to meet that plan, or if they are unable to meet that plan, then yes, separation is advisable.
Gotcha. Well, Gleb, thanks for coming on the show. How can people find out more about you and pick up a copy of the book?
Well, it's very easy to pick up a copy of the book. Just go to Amazon.com and type in Returning to the Office and Leading Hybrid and Remote Teams, and you'll get the book. So the full name of the book is Returning to the Office and Leading the Hybrid and Remote Teams, a manual on benchmarking to best practices for competitive advantage. And my name is Gleb Tspiursky, so you'll see that, but there's only one book with that name. Now, for me, more about me, go to disasteravoidanceexperts.com and check that out. There's going to be blogs, videocasts, podcasts, all sorts of manuals, books, white papers, coaching, consulting, training options that you can find out. Especially check out disasteravoidanceexperts.com/subscribe for a free 8-video-based course on making the wisest decisions with an assessment on addressing cognitive biases, these dangerous judgment errors in the workplace that cause a lot of leaders to make bad decisions. So again, check that out at disasteravoidanceexperts.com/subscribe.
Excellent. Thanks so much. And I'll link that up in the show notes as well. And so people can get that from geekleader.com. Gleb, thanks a lot. Really appreciate having you on.
Thank you so much for inviting me, John. It's been a pleasure.
If you enjoyed that episode, please leave a rating and review in Apple Podcasts. I'd greatly appreciate that. And also don't forget to check out merch. We have some t-shirts that I've designed that are on at geekleader.com. You can click on the merchandise section there and check that out. And also don't forget about the books from our guests. So if you like this guest and other guests that have written books, please go ahead and check that out at geekleader.com. I would greatly appreciate it, and I'm sure they would too.